From the book of James, 2nd chapter, verses 8 through 13. You all will do well if you actually fulfill the majestic law according to the scripture. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you show favoritism, you commit sin and are convicted by law as transgressors. For whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point becomes accountable for the whole. For the one who said, "You shall not commit adultery," also said, "You shall not commit murder." Now, if you do not commit adultery, but if you do murder, you have become transgressor of the law. So speak and so act as those who are to be judged by the law of liberty. For judgment will be merciful to anyone who has shown no mercy. Mercy shouts victory over judgment.
Our second reading for this morning comes from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 7, beginning at verse 14. Prior to our reading, Jesus has been having a conversation. People have been trying to pin him down about why his disciples don't follow the ritual hand washing before they come to worship. And now we have another discussion. Jesus called the crowd again and said to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a woman or man that by going into them has the power to defile. Rather, what comes out of a person is what defiles a person." Now, when Jesus had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about the parable. He said to them, "Are you all then also without understanding? Do you all not see that whatever goes into a woman or man from the outside has no power to defile? For it does not enter the heart, but rather the stomach, and then just goes out into the sewer." Jesus also said, "It is what comes out of a woman or man that defiles. For it's from within, from the human heart, that evil thoughts come, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, an evil eye or envy, slander, pride, thoughtlessness. All of these things come from within, and they defile a person." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Before we begin the sermon this morning, I just want to remind folks at home that we are having communion today. And so if you're at home, please have your bit of bread and juice or wine so that you can join with us. And I do also, Johnny Summers, I found the bread. It's right here on the front pew. So if you could find a plate and bring the bread, that would be lovely so that we will have it at that time. It was the missing bread, which, by the way, was made for us lovingly by Ronnie Moscow, and we appreciate her efforts and her culinary skills. So there are multiple places in the Bible where you can find a story or a teaching or maybe a finger-wagging warning that causes us to say to ourselves, "Oh, well, that doesn't apply today. It's helpful to read and understand for historical content, but I don't see myself in that situation that I just read about in that particular book of the Bible." Well, this reading from the Gospel of Mark is one of those kinds of teachings. To us, everyone seems overly concerned about ritual hand washing and eating kosher. we have sort of just dropped into this conversation that has been going on since the beginning of this chapter. You may want to read all of Mark 7 at some point. We've dropped in, and it seems to us from where we sit that this particular controversy about food is no longer applicable to us today. Actually, this conversation between Jesus and the Jewish leaders, between Jesus and a crowd who he invited up, and then later Jesus and his disciples who still don't get it and ask him to repeat it again, this conversation is deep and unsettling. It rocks to the core any faithful Jew. Jesus is challenging two long-held practices that shape them as a people: ritual hand washing, used before worship, and strict dietary laws that are designed to keep out anything impure from defiling them or making them dirty. He knows very well that the Jews are committed to ritual purity, doing anything they can to avoid being unclean and therefore unfit for worship in their eyes. Perhaps you remember the very well-known parable that Jesus told about that man who was beaten up and left on the roadside. When a temple leader walked by and went to the other side of the road to avoid him, not necessarily because he wasn't compassionate, but because he was concerned about defiling himself by touching someone who had bloody wounds. Purity was a key faith practice. What does and does not go into the mouth is essential to being a faithful Jew. The laws, they go way back to Leviticus and Numbers, but over the years and centuries, those same laws have become even more restrictive by the human changes over the years. If you read in some of the other New Testament letters and in the book of Acts, this is not a topic that is treated lightly by the early Christian church. They argued with one another about it. They shamed one another about it. And they even caused community conflict over this issue of what is the right thing to eat. The apostles struggled with a decision in regarding how many of the non-Jews what kind of laws they had to follow in order to be included into this new church. Eating the right food was central to Jewish piety. But now, Jesus has kind of turned things inside out by saying, it really doesn't matter what goes into your mouth. That makes people uncomfortable anytime. Most of us get uncomfortable, don't we, when our traditional faith practices are challenged? When a pastor starts reading biblical translations from a Black womanist perspective, we can get shaken up a bit, squirming in our pews at the different kind of language. When a pandemic forces us to take communion with those pre-packaged little cups and the wafers that taste terrible, we grumble. That's not the way we're used to eating the Lord's Supper in our tradition. When the church session approves the use of our sanctuary for weddings for any couple, we wonder about how much the church has changed since we were children. When unfamiliar music becomes a part of worship, we feel uncomfortable and we feel less connected to God in some way because we feel like we're missing a piece of that music tradition that we're comfortable with. It's not a food controversy anymore, but we do indeed have our own external practices that shape our understanding of who we are as committed Presbyterians and as faithful Christians. In this gospel passage from the Gospel of Mark, Jesus basically turns the existing dietary practices inside out and hangs them up to dry. This does not only affect those first hearers of Jesus while he was around, but it also continues to affect that first generation of Christians after Jesus has risen and ascended into heaven. The Jewish Christians who heard Mark's account of this gospel were still very concerned about keeping the Jewish laws, including the food restrictions. They'd grown up with it. They'd followed it all of their life long, and they found it very uncomfortable to accept the idea that ritual purity could be compromised in any way. Now, Jesus is giving them a new definition of keeping clean or pure. What he's saying is what food you eat is irrelevant to keeping clean. What you eat passes right through the body and goes out into the sewer, he says. It's almost like Jesus is using potty talk, which we tell our kids to not do. There's nothing that can be wrong with what goes into the body. It seems Mark, the gospel writer, adds a little editorial interpretation here, explaining what it means in case someone's unclear. He says, Jesus is saying all food is okay. You don't have to keep kosher. Keeping clean or unclean is an internal matter, not an external one. Rather, it's what's on the inside that really counts. What feelings, words, decisions that come out of the body, what you do, how you live, all of this is definitely more important than what you eat. This teaching would have made it possible for non-Jews to be a part of the Christian family. I do want to interrupt and say I'm not saying you should eat dessert all day long. I'm not saying you should drink soda instead of water, but we're going with what Jesus and his compatriots were concerned about, is eating the right food to stay right with God. I kind of like the analogy of signposts that was used by N.T. Wright, a British author and theologian. He suggests that we can refer to the practices that define a particular faith community as the signposts that kind of mark who we are. In this case, keeping the purity laws were signposts for those Jewish Christians. Others were keeping the designated holy feasts and festivals. Another was males being circumcised, where they were the signposts that defined them. We have our own signposts as Christians today. The Lord's Supper, which we will celebrate in a few minutes, is a signpost for us. It's a marker of our identity and our connection with Jesus Christ. The empty cross is a marker for us of our belief in the risen Lord. It's another signpost. Presbyterians welcome infants to be baptized with water here in our sanctuary. That sets us apart from some other groups who only practice believer baptism. Infant baptism is one of our signposts. Jesus rearranges the signposts, and that becomes difficult. He points out that these signposts are actually irrelevant to what God means by purity or holiness. He teaches a deeper kind of purity that comes from within. He's put up a new sign, you might say, that makes us all clean, and that sign is he himself. N.T. Wright calls him purity with a capital P. That's who Jesus is for us. It's not the food we eat that identifies us or marks us as either clean or unclean. It's the words we say. It's the things we do. It's the life we live. It's a purity of our motive. It's what comes out of us is healthy, positive, helpful, loving, grace-filled, then we're clean. If what comes out of us is unhealthy or negative or harmful or selfish or unforgiving, we're unclean. It's what comes out from the inside that counts, not what comes in from the outside. Jesus provides in this conversation with the disciples a list of the evil or sinful things that can come out of us from within, things that are impure. Sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, thoughtlessness. 12 things in his list. That's the deeper definition of defilement. Defilement that really matters. Defilement that impacts not only us, but the people who are around us. Now, some of this list will not fit you at all, but surely one or more of them have belonged to you at some point in your life, erupting out from within you with words or actions. We can't blame the sin and evil that comes from within on an outer circumstance or other people, or even say, the devil made me do it. We make the choice. We react to those circumstances around us. Sin and evil which come from within end up showing themselves on the outside. You can't hide it. So I want to ask you this morning, have you ever taken time to do an internal scan of yourself? I don't mean an MRI, I don't mean a CT scan. I mean the kind of scan you can take for yourself, stopping long enough to pay attention to what you have going on inside. Listen to your heart. Where is it focused at the moment? Look at the attitudes you are wearing. Maybe your attitude about your workplace, your attitude about a particular person, your attitude about life in general. Pay attention to your gut. Is it at rest and calm, or is it in turmoil over something? An internal scan is kind of like a quick emotional check-in. What is bubbling up inside at the moment? A twinge of envy? A fear of something new? Anger at yourself sometimes, or anger at someone else? Greed or jealousy? An internal scan is valuable, you see, even if it just allows us to acknowledge what's going on inside. What's out of place? What is creating discomfort or pain? An internal scan can help you to recognize why certain behaviors seem to be popping up. What is going on inside is directly related to what we say and what we do and what we decide. When you find any of the evil or harmful things lurking inside of you, these are the things that threaten to create distance between you and God in a much deeper way than failing to fulfill any external faith practice. It's time to seek out God's help, to root them out, to push them aside, and to replace them with anything that does not defile. Paul's list in Galatians of the fruit of the Spirit come to mind as things that could be replacements for anything evil and sinful. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Continuing with the food conversation, these fruits that Paul mentions are the kinds of food that come from the inside out that are positive. These are the kinds of things that lead to fulfilling the great commandment highlighted by James, love your neighbor as yourself. The truth of who we are comes from the heart and is visible in our actions day after day. Amen. You may be seated.